one more time, welcome to feature data. One more time, sorry about that. Yeah, welcome to Cloud Data Driven Online User Group Meeting. So for today's presentation, we have John Manner. John Manner is a great friend of mine. Yeah, and it's a pleasure to have such great data expert like that. And yeah, for your information, my name is Jean-Joseph. I'm a data engineer and work for Microsoft as a technical trainer. With me on the data-driven community, we have Wonen. Wonen is the first guy that maintaining the community, and I am the founder and the secondary co-organizer. We also have Anna with us, and this community is run on the Microsoft data community user group. So therefore, if you are free to comment and make sure, for example, we do it with respect and appreciation. And we have today John Manner, and John Manner will talk about moving up to the Azure cloud with a PostgreSQL database in the sky. And I happen to be a big fan of Postgres. Yeah, and John Manner, it's really a pleasure to have you today. Feel free to start with the presentation, introduce yourself. Okay.
Sure. Thank you, Gene. I appreciate it. If you don't mind going on mute, I'm getting a lot of feedback here.
Sure.
That'd be awesome. I will periodically look in the chat to see if there's any messages, but we'll go from there. So today I'm going to talk about moving on up to the cloud with a PostgreSQL database in the cloud, okay? And it's a little play on words, so I'll tell you the reason why I came up with this title. I'll tell you about the background behind this. I had a client that recently wanted some SQL help, and it was SQL Server, and I was like, sure, why not? I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been using SQL Server since 6.5, not a big deal. So it was on Google, and I did some migrations for them, and then suddenly like, hey, we want to get rid of license costs. How much is it going to take to actually move on up to the cloud with a PostgreSQL database in the cloud? And so I spent a couple months doing this, migrating databases from SQL Server to Postgres, and those learnings are the basis for this talk, okay? I'm not claiming that I'm a Postgres, expert. I'm not a Postgres novice. I'm somewhere in between. I will be learning a lot about Postgres this year, okay? And we'll be writing about it at MS SQL Tips. So if you want to come along with the journey, read my articles, I'm learning just like you, okay? So again, my name's John Miner. I'm a data platform MVP. I work for a company called Insight. Enough about me, and let's get on with the presentation. So you can see that I'm getting a little older, not so much, hair going on here. I'm from the 70s. I was born in 1968, okay? And so these are the typical sitcoms that were there, okay? The Jeffersons, All in the Family, Happy Days, okay? These were funny sitcoms, right? The Jeffersons had a talk about moving on up to the east side. We finally got a piece of the pie in the sky, right? And that's basically the twist of words for this presentation. It's talking about saving money, right? And also at the same time upward mobility. And that's what you can do with Postgres. It's a great database. We'll talk about its strengths and talk about its weaknesses. We'll also talk about how to take an existing project which isn't written in Microsoft SQL Server and migrate it to Postgres. Okay. So purpose. Many companies are looking to reduce licensing costs, okay? And also, you might be, acquired by another company that's using Postgres. So they might win the battle and say, hey, guess what? We want you to move from SQL Server to Postgres. How can you do it, right? And basically, I'm going to go through, what are the pitfalls that you might encounter when moving the database schema and refactoring the code, okay? And it's a three-part thing. You want to move the schema, you want to move the data, and you want to refactor and apply the code and test, right? The problem with these SQL databases, SQL's been around for a quarter of a century, right? I think it just passed a couple of years ago. Bob Ward was saying, hey, 25 years, we're going past 25 years. So there might be a lot of garbage out there, and usually garbage in means garbage out, right? So we're going to have to look at those views. We're going to have to look at those store procedures, uh, do some learnings, and, make the best of it and modernize, okay? And some of the modernizing could be, making sure the code's performant. Do you have this huge store procedure that is 5,000 lines, okay, in size? If so, then how do we break it into chunks that are logical, that are performant, that are logged, so we know what the run times are, the metrics, and we can say, hey, this chunk is actually causing problems now. How do we optimize it, okay? Topics. So we're going to talk about how do we do this migration? What's the methodology to do it, okay? First thing is we need to know what to move, right? So we need inventory. Second thing is we kind of need a baseline, right? We need to know the memory, the disk, right? This compute it's using now, so we can, correctly pick what we're going to do in the cloud, okay? Third thing is we're in the cloud, right? So back in the day, I would go to my, infrastructure guy and say, hey, I need a computer. And he'd say, okay, I'll order a computer. And it comes in, you rack it. Hopefully it came with an OS. If not, you had to install a Windows Server on it and you had to put some software on it, right? Well, nowadays you can kind of still do that. Infrastructure as a service we'll talk about versus platform as a service. And there's two options that you can pick from the cloud, okay? Once we deploy the service, okay, now we have to kind of look at the internals of the database, right? We have data definition language, okay, so it's how we create the tables and schemas. And then we have, the store procedures and any of the code base objects, triggers, and views we have to redesign, okay? And we'll talk about other topics, like you might be doing some interesting stuff like full text indexing. How do you support that in PostgreSQL? We'll cover over this. We're going to focus mainly on the migration methodology, as well as any pitfalls that I saw during migrating a sample database. It's the pubs database. It's the very first one I started with. It came out with SQL Server 7.0. Okay, history lesson. So it's always good to figure out where these products come from and why we're going to study them and why do we want to learn them. A lot of things came out of Berkeley, UCLA, or any of the colleges, right? Like, for instance, Spock came out of a college, right, in California. I think it's UCLA. So in 1986, this professor, Michael Stoneberg, basically got a lot of government agencies, like a lot of them like NSA, three-letter acronyms to give him grants to start this project, okay? The problem is it was based upon something called Ingress, and it was kind of slow, and it had its own language. It wasn't really SQL compliant. So the biggest release after 1986, what it became, is 1985. Andrew Yu and Jolly Chen added the SQL language, right? And everyone uses SQL. So before then, it had its own language to do queries, and guess what? They, in 95, went back and they rewrote it and they made sure it was SQL compliant. One of the interesting thing is they also made it performant, right? They went back and recoded in seed for speed. And that has happened a lot, even in the recent future. Like if you look at Postgres and you look at Databricks, right? Databricks, the Spark engine was written in Scala, but they were having runtime issues. It wasn't going fast enough. So the Photon optimizer was rewriting part of the Spark engine, right, using C++, so it could go fast, okay? And it's not surprising that they did that in 1996. One of the things you will see out there is cool logos, right? Anything that's open source has a cool logo, and so this is an elephant. It's associated with PostgreSQL. And again, you can see the name has changed. It used to be Postgres. Then it was Postgres 95. Well, that doesn't kind of stay for prosperity, right? Because it will be 96, 97. It's kind of like SQL Server. It just keeps on adding numbers. What version are you on? It's just PostgreSQL, and there's a version number after it. So why do we want to learn this? Well, there's a place out there called DB Engine Rankings, okay? And if you go out there, guess what? You can see the rankings. It's based upon what are people doing out there, what posts are doing, what questions they're putting on Stack Overflow. Okay. If you know the top four, which are basically SQL databases, anti-SQL databases, then you'll be pretty marketable. And that's why I decided to learn Postgres this year and become really more from a novice to intermediate or expert because I think it's definitely there. I already know SQL Server. I've done a bunch of Oracle. I know MySQL, and Postgres was the final one to add to my bucket list. Okay. So that's why I would suggest learning it. Also, guess what? You don't have to pay licensing. So that's something we'll get to. Okay. So how we're going to do this migration? Well, the first thing is to take an inventory, right? Because if we don't have an inventory, then we don't know what to move. Second thing is, there's probably someone in your company who's been sitting around using this database forever. They're called the subject matter expert SME, right? So ask them these following questions and maybe you can get some answers like, how many databases do you have? And what you really want to know is what's the current size and expected growth? Is it a gigabyte database? Is it a toy database? Like we're going to be talking about pubs, which is a toy database. It's kilobytes, if not megabytes. And then we have, if it's terabytes, then you have to size it accordingly, right? How's the usage pattern in a database, right? Is it an online transaction processing? That means people are reading and writing to it and updating all the time? Or is it something that's write once and read many, like it's a warehouse, right? It's analytical processing. And basically that dictates what type of storage you need. So, and I mean, how you gonna, are you gonna use something that might be some type of calm store technology? Are you gonna put it on faster disk? All those things could be answered by the usage pattern. We know that databases don't live by themselves. So you want to ask, is it tightly coupled? Okay, and tightly coupled would be cross-database queries. And if so, you have to know where they are because there's a dependency on the migration, right? If database B talks to database A, then through a store procedure or a function, then guess what? Database A has to be deployed before database B. A lot of times you will need to have high availability or disaster recovery. That should have been DR. So I will fix that. I apologize. It's a brand new slide deck, and this is for DR. I'll look and fix that and get it updated. So it depends on how much infrastructure you need out there. Is a backup good enough? A daily backup? What's your RTO, RPO, which is return time, time objective versus point objectives? How long are you going to take to restore versus what point? How much are you willing to lose? So there's a lot of questions there. And there's additional configurations, right? Like I worked with a bunch of rocket scientists and they were really rocket scientists. And Insight was bidding for the US Air Force. And it was a bunch of, they want to know when ships didn't see satellites. So it was a bunch of geospatial data that they had to process. Guess what? There's a whole database called Postgres GIS. It's extension now. Before it used to have to be a special install. And kind of to jump to what is extensions? Extensions is kind of like SQL Server. If you want to have, say, I'm thinking of something that you have to install separately, like SSIS, you install it as a separate install. And that's the same thing with extensions. You say, hey, guess what? It's not part of the original deployment, but I want this extension. Okay. Baselines are very important, okay, to understand where your database is, right? So how much memory is going to be allocated and used, right? So for instance, if you need 4 gigabytes, then if you deploy to a service that's 2, you're going to have issues, right? So you need that baseline. You also need storage baseline. IOPS, right? IOPS depend upon how fast the disk can read write, right? So if you want to know what you're currently using and can you get away with less or do you need more? Connections per hour. That's kind of, or it could even be minute if it's really busy. And every connection usually takes some type of memory, right? And you might want to ask, hey, is it performant now? Because if it isn't performant now, you better go ahead and fix the performance problems on your current system or take it as a known risk, okay? When collecting this data, I suggest using a tool, right? And baseline the old system, like, hey, how was it running on SQL Server? What's our performance metrics? And the new system, hey, we moved to Postgres in the cloud. What's the difference? Again, deploying a new system that's slow is not going to make your users happy. Deploying to the cloud on a new system that is more performant, guess what? Users will be happy. Okay, what do we pick? Hey, I'm an Azure guy. If given a choice, I love to do Azure, but I am a consultant also. So, I go where the money is, where the work is, right? So this chart basically says that it lives in all three clouds. You can do Microsoft Azure, you can do Amazon Web Service, or you can do Google Cloud. The question is, there's only two options, right? There's no software as a service. And software as a service is kind of like Salesforce or Office 365, Google Docs, that's software as a service. Platform as a service. That means you don't have to worry about backups. You don't have to worry about patching. You don't have to worry about the OS and the bits for the database, okay? Microsoft or someone else is going to do it, okay? Three offers are out there for the three clouds, right? Amazon RDS, Google Cloud SQL. And they have three variants. They have SQL Server, and most of them do have the three variants, SQL Server, MySQL, and also PostgreSQL. Azure has something called Azure SQL Database. There's a standalone version that's going away. We're going to be talking about the flexible server version today. Okay. You can also build your own, right? We can deploy a VM like EC2 or a Microsoft Azure VM or say a compute or container, and then make sure on a container. Excuse me. There's a little feedback. Make sure on the container that you store the bits, okay? So again, this is a lot of background. There's going to be some demos. I just want to tell you the choices out there before we get into how do we do it, okay? Infrastructure deployment, right? So the question is this something that you're going to do one time, or is this something that you need to set up to do for multiple servers, right? So one of the things out there is different ways to deploy, okay? So I'm putting on the right here, we can see there's some actual cool images, right? GitHub Actions is very popular nowadays. And then GitHub Actions, you could do like, for instance, when I was in Google, the GCP has CLI to do actual work. Azure has CLI, right? We also have ARM templates, right? If you like, PowerShell, okay? So if it's a one-time deployment, then do it by hand. Who cares, right? Or maybe 2 or 3 times. But if you think you're doing it multiple times and you want a consistent look and feel, then you're going to have to do Azure DevOps or some type of pipeline, or you're going to have to do Terraform's very popular too. Again, I just want to expose to you the DevOps tools out there, and you're just going to have to learn them because that's a whole talk in itself. Okay. Finally got somewhere. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the pubs database, and I'm also going to share with you once I switch to demos, all the background information. Okay, so you can get 3 articles I wrote on MS SQL tips on how to do a P as employment, an I as employment. I also talk about the math database, how to calculate primes and how to schedule it. So 3 good articles on MS SQL tips. Today I'm doing something brand new, so that's why I said this slide deck's brand new, hot off the press. I'm doing the pubs database, and the pubs database is great because there's a lot of different objects there, and we can go through a whole, conversion, migration. I can show you how to do, show you a freeware tool that's written in Perl that do some of the work for you, show you how to do the heavy lifting on coding, where I found some difficulties, and you should have the complete picture to do a migration, okay? So the pubs database is a very, small database. If we look at it and count it, I think there's 11 tables, okay? And it's, basically an employee has jobs and a publisher with some information, titles, some schedule, royalty, schedule, how I'm going to get paid, right? Sales, stores and discounts, and authors and author titles, okay? So we can see a nice little ER diagram here. So what do we want to do? We first want to get the scripted tables out, right? Then we want to either script or do an ETL out of the data. Then we want to basically convert the SQL code, okay? We talked about an inventory, so let's do an inventory. Initially, it was written in SSMS, so that's where I published it, okay? How do I get it out, right? First thing we can do is there's a right click and you do reports, and reports gives you a nice list of all the tables and all the record counts, okay? And we can see this is truly a toy database because we're not talking megabytes or gigabytes, we're talking kilobytes, okay? We can also run some tools like SP space used, and that tells us, hey, by the way, the database at most is 16 megabytes, right? And we have a majority of it allocated. It looks like about 3 or 4 megabytes, okay? We can also do select star from sysobjects and get a listing of what we're actually migrating over. So we have 6 check constraints, 9 default constraints. Problem with foreign keys and primary keys is that when we go ahead and create the schema, we don't want to apply them right away. Otherwise, you have to worry about the order of precedence when running your inserts, okay? So if I'm moving data over and there's a foreign key, parent-child relationship, right? The parent has to exist before the child. The order could get quite complicated. So it's a lot easier to not worry about those, keep them off, and apply them after you do the data conversion. We can see there's some stored code we have to worry about, right? We have a store procedures for, there's one trigger and one view. So we have 6 objects that we have to manually go through and make sure the code is changed. The script that I gave you doesn't do anything with code. It just does the schema. Okay, and I'll show you. It's freeware. You can go pick it up and play with it. Okay. Convert table definitions. So there's several options out there. First, you can go look, there's third-party products. Problem is third-party products, more than likely, it'll do some of the hefty lifting. Even this product that's freeware, it did get some things wrong. I'll talk about what I had to do to fix it. The one thing I do like is there's something called SQL Server to PostgreSQL. It's at the end of this article, all the links. And it's just a Perl script. I'll show you how to use it. It's easy, and we'll demo it today. What's on my to-do list is a Python class called SQL Glide. I don't know if you heard about this. It's been out there for a while. Whoever wrote it was doing a lot of PySpark and Presto, and he was having to go back and forth between the two, and he got tired of it. So he just wrote a class to say, hey, here's the SQL statement. How do I make it look like PySpark? How do I make it look like Presto? How do I make it look like MySQL? So this one supports 18 different dialects, and it's on my bucket list to learn. So we're going to talk about the Perl script right now. This is a good segue. Is there any questions? Okay, no questions. Cool. So going to minimize this, and I'm going to show you some links. So first thing I want you to do is you can go out to MS SQL tips, and if we do a quick search of Postgres, we can see this is the IaaS article I talked about. This is the PS because it's using Azure portal and it's basically a math database. And here's a conversion, okay? So you can look at those 3 articles, very good. Second thing is, where's the code for today, right? It's right here. So I'll post this in the actual chat window. You're going to get the code before the migrations, right? It's a SQL Server pubs database. You can install it. You can do a right click and say generate script and just get the tables, right? That's what we're going to work on. After we do that, there's an intermediate state. I'm going to talk about how the script works and how it creates a bunch of files. The SQL Server dump is the same thing as, I just renamed it because the script initially came this way, as right-click export from SSMS. So that's the code right there. It creates 3 files, and we'll talk about them and demo them shortly. Last but not least, okay, is the final state. And this is where we have 7 files. If we run them in the right order, guess what? We get a data conversion and the database deployed, okay? So let me cut and paste that into the window. So I'm going to chat, and someone asked, will there be a copy of the presentation? And you have everything, Louis. So cool. So let's show you what I am. If you haven't seen Azure, I'm going to talk a little about it. Don't need too much fundamentals about it other than 2 things. This is my user account I logged in, and this is a dashboard I created for this talk. It's called Postgres Demo. And it has 2 things. It has a VM running, which is down here. I'm connected to RDP to it. And it has something called Azure Database for PostgreSQL, and it's called the flexible server option. Okay. So some things you can reset the password, you can stop it. Yes, it's a division of compute and storage. Problem. If you stop it because it wants to take backups every 7 days, it wakes it up and leaves it on. Way to get around this, and I still haven't done this yet. It's on my bucket list, so maybe I'll put this on here, is the script in my own account to just shut it down. So every day, just look at it. Hey, it's been turned on by Microsoft. Shut it down. Save some money, right? Let's look at what it is, right? So we can see these are tags. It's Postgres version 3. There's some availability zones there, okay? It's burstable, so it has 8 cores, 32 gigs of RAM, and 32 gigs of storage, okay? And we can also look at like connection, okay? And a connection basically tells you how to get to it. So it's server PG15 because it's the version for Postgres database, right? We can see it's there. And PostgreSQL is the default user, okay? And there's a bunch of other things. The only thing I think that's really interesting, other than that, we can see if there's multiple databases. We can see there's a Postgres. This is the default database. This is kind of like master, but not really. There's the math database that I talked about, and we're working with the pubs database. I already deployed it. We're going to drop it and redo it again, okay? There's one other thing I want to talk about before I move over here. Here we go, high availability. Nice thing about using platform as a service is if you were doing high availability by yourself and rolling it out, you'd have to have like 2 VMs, stall replication, so you have synchronous replication like logs between the two. Then you would have a warm standby, right? Guess what? Microsoft does it already for you. Click a button, hit save. Guess what? It does all the deployment, syncs them up. So save you some time if you want to spend the money to go ahead and do it. I'm going to show you how to do this, but right now I'm going to show you the end result is we want a schema called DBO. Okay, that has a bunch of tables, right? Cool. Interesting, if I run this, right, it's a drop database followed by a create database. It's going to fail because there's this rule that says you can't do them within the same transaction block. The syntax is a little different, okay? Anytime you use double quotes, it's not a string. It's thinking that you're passing a table name or a field, okay? So be careful with that. Second thing, there's a with for. So you know how in SQL Server you can drop connections? That's basically, so for some reason I'm in the database by mistake, so I'm going to close out of here. Can't drop it if I'm in it, right? Even if I say force, we'll go to like the master database Postgres, right? We're going to go query tool, and we're going to load, okay, the first one, which is create database. And what we're going to do is we're just going to run this, and this is going to drop it. And it says done. So I got rid of everything, all the data. And if we hit refresh, it's sure enough gone, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to recreate it. Postgres is the default power user. So I'm going to run this. And now if we right click and hit refresh, okay, we have a bunch. Okay, so let's go ahead. I will get rid of this, and we can bring up SSMS if you wanted to. Okay. And while that's loading, I'm going to show you what the results are. So we have on my desktop, okay, something called MS to PG, Microsoft to Postgres, okay? What is this? Strawberry. What is this? Strawberry is a Perl distribution. That's all it is, okay? I also have the script that does the conversion, and I have 2 commands. So what does the open command do? Well, we need to run this from the command line. Open basically says, go to the directory, open it. I also say, hey, guess what? Create a path to the bin directory for the Perl, because we want to run Perl, and then start a command window, okay? So this gets us right there. Boom. We're ready to run the conversion. What I did already, and I'll log in to show you, is I just basically went into the pubs database, right? And you can just go task, if I can find it, it might be on itself, right? Task. and then generate scripts. And when we do generate scripts, right, you can do the whole database. We can say, hey, guess what? We just want tables, right? And that's how I got the final file. Okay. So I'm going to close that. And we have this Postgres, right? We opened it. And what we need to do is we need the code. And where did the code go? Maybe I got rid of it. I can just restart because I don't think I got rid of it totally. I want to restart this one. It's cleaning up house. So let's show you what this is. So this is the dump, okay, from SQL Server. Now I put some comments in here. I did 3 passes, okay. First one is that when we run this, okay, it is not going to understand how to do types, okay. So maybe if I have some time this year and I want to do a open source project, I might go look at what the fellow developer did for translation and rewrite it in PowerShell, because I like PowerShell standalone, don't have to install Perl. Second thing is it didn't handle types. So it should be able to say, hey, if this type's here, guess what? Go ahead and replace all the types. So that was my first step. Take, employee ID, replace it to char9. Take, DBO ID and replace it to whatever. So I did all those. Now I have a script that's ready to actually be converted, okay? What we do is we have the script that the DOS command window that has the correct path to my Perl. And I just did something called run. And run basically just says, hey, take the dump and create 3 files, a before, after, and unsure file, okay? And let's bring those up and talk about them. So the nice thing about the way this was done with the developer, he went ahead and said, guess what? I understand that more than likely you want to do data conversion. So I'm going to break it into a bunch of tables. So here's all your tables. Okay. He did get it wrong because see this pub date not null. In the previous it was null. So that's wrong. So if I did rewrite this, you have to make sure that, fields that don't have to be not null are not null, meaning that should be nullable, right? I had to insert, it broke. So I had to go back and change the definition. Okay. Second thing, we already talked about this, the original dump files, right? This is the open command. So the other 2 files after just the schema are something that says, hey, by the way, this is what we want to apply after you load the tables, right? And we can see this is a sequence and then the rest are either primary keys or foreign keys. Okay, cool. And there's also some defaults, okay? So perfect. No problems with that. And then there's stuff that it didn't understand how to convert. Like for instance, and it's actually converted wrong. See this one, it says quote 09, but it's missing a bracket there. See, it's missing a bracket here. And the original code was capital FM. And also current timestamp might not be the syntax, okay? So you're gonna have to change the syntax. So that's where I made changes. So let's go back to the slide deck and then we'll go through actually running. So we did the conversion. Okay, let's talk about database tools. Minimize this, paste this up. And okay, so I didn't tell you is that guess what? The workhorse that you're going to be using is pgadmin, right? It's basically the GUI. But there's also a PS SQL. We'll talk about that really quickly. A database without scheduling is really not that useful, right? So there's 2 things. If you're doing standalone, PGA agent is an extension that you can do. Read my article they did for MS SQL Tips, shows you how to use it. If you use an Azure service, there's you just right click and there's components you can add. Okay, it's through the Azure portal. One's called Crom, same thing, okay? Another thing you're probably gonna do is a database without connectivity is no database at all, right? So how you get into it, ODBC driver or JDBC driver. So both are useful for writing ETL, also for reports or applications. Okay, create empty tiles. Sorry, create empty tables. So I've chose to use SQL Flexible's offer for this demo. Okay, you've already seen that. The output from the Perl script allows the tables to be defined without foreign keys or primary keys, which is awesome. By default, Postgres supports the public schema. I'll show you that. I'm going to convert it to DBO so it's one-to-one for the looking like SQL Server, so we don't have to change our application if it was looking for DBO, okay? When you're using a platform as a service, you don't have any control of the files, right? It's just like Azure SQL Database. You can say, hey, I want a new table space, but the table space, the location's picked by Azure. You don't get a chance to actually pick it. But if you're using PostgreSQL on a VM, you can say I want a table space and actually put it into a certain area, right? I want to put it in this directory is for Crafty DBA. This directory is for, I don't know, some auto sales database, okay? So our next demo is to create the schema and empty tables, okay? And I'll show you what I did change to get them to work correctly. So again, I'll go really quickly to just after and show you that there is options here to tell it a different schema, but it just dumped everything into public. So once you create the database, you would say, hey, I want to put it in public. I don't want public, I want DBO, okay? So I'm gonna put a new folder here called intermediate. Okay, and let's move these out because we're not using these, but they're there to show you how the conversion does. And then there's some handwork to do, right? So the first one we did is we created a database, but there's nothing in it yet, right? If we look at schemas, the default schema that comes with Postgres is public, okay? So I wrote them in different steps because we can run them with a tool for deployment. We'll talk about that in the near future. Remember I told you there's a command line tool. If you really like the command line, you click it, you can get a window and it just shows you, hey, guess what? I'm at the command line window and you could just do things here. There's a lot of catalog tables. I don't know them by heart. There's also information schema, okay, which is cross database independent tables. Those are the ones I would suggest using. So create schema and table. So let's take a look. Other than putting documentation on it, I said, hey, guess what? If the schema exists, drop it and then create a new one. When we do work in PostgreSQL, it's very, very important to have semicolons. Otherwise, things are going to break. We can also see I have the same thing here, but everything's double quoted and everything's DBO versus, public. Last but not least, if we go all the way down, remember I said I had a problem with this timestamp's been fixed. Okay, so we just did a begin and a commit. We also did some statements at the top. So let's run it. Sometimes maybe I'd have to create another do block to do this. So I'm going to drop it. I'm going to create it. Okay, and then run it here. So manually it works. If I was going to put this in a install script, I'd have a little more tweaking to do because it said, hey, by the way, it doesn't like it. So I'd probably have to put it in the code block. It doesn't see it yet. Go ahead. Sorry. So if we hit refresh, right, we got DBO. And now if we go into tables, we have all our tables. So we've built empty tables at this point. How do we get data in? Okay, good question. And that's a good segue to the next slide. Okay, we did empty tables. Okay, how do we migrate data, right? And that's this one. So let's move this up and talk about it. So there's many different ways to move data. Pick your favorite ETL tool, okay? The pub database is basically a toy database. That's what we talked about, right? And so at that point, we can just do insert statements. That's what I'm going to do, okay? And we can use SSMS to create those and then fix them. Another golden oldie, if I was migrating from SQL Server to Postgres, you can write a sys package, right? Just use the correct database. So we have the old system, we're going to migrate to the new. If there's huge amounts of data and you want short cutover, then this is not going to be the way to go. You'll have to use the ETL tool. Please put yourself on mute. Thank you. Okay. So modernizing can can you go on mute unless you have a question? Venkat, you have a question or? Please go on mute then. Thank you.
Azure.
Okay, so modernized code is the hardest part of migration, okay? So we're going to do two of these. So the first one I'm going to talk about is migrating the data. I'm going to show you the insert statements and what I had to make changes for us to work, okay? Second one, I'm going to talk about modernizing code, okay? Here's some main differences between SQL Server, okay, and SQL, okay? First thing is the database is case sensitive, okay? So if you're looking for the data, you're going to have to use an ILIKE, which is an in-case sensitive search, okay? Second thing is when you code, okay, there's different languages, okay, that's supported for the stored code. I'm not talking views, I'm talking about triggers, functions, stored procedures. They can be written in PGSQL, which is ANSI SQL type version for Postgres. I suggest using it, but you have many other options like Perl, TCL, and Python. There's a lot of cool things, so many cool things that you can do with this database. You can do inheritance, you can do arrays. Just can't even talk about them in this beginner's, migration talk. Please stay tuned. I'll probably be talking about more of them on MS SQL tips, okay? There's also different statements, okay, that's supported, like a do, a loop, okay? Basically, while loop and support for it for MS SQL is not too good, and variable scoping, okay? Just like SQL Server, you have a bunch of different hashes, right? So for instance, btrieve, you got a hash, they're all different types. Again, we'll do that in another presentation. So let's go back to inventory and talk about modernization. So we have 4 stored procedures, 1 view, 1 trigger. Okay, and suggest, using PGSQL for coding because again, just make a little change here. Okay, perfect, save it. Okay, so let's go into what we were talking about here and minimize. So right now we have empty tables. How can we load it? Okay, we're going to do a query. Okay, so I'm going to use my query tool. And I'm going to bring up the next script. And I already fixed the script. So we did the schema. Is there any default constraints? Those might be needed because we might have a sequence, right? So we have a sequence here. We have a bunch of defaults that we might want to have too, right? And you can see that the sequence is created here, but this job ID says set default next val. That's kind of like in Oracle or whatever database you have. And then it points to the actual sequence, okay? It's going to run this. And now if we went to, let's pick on the jobs table. If we went to jobs table, okay, we could see there's columns, right? We have these columns. Where's the sequence? I know up top there's sequences, so we can look and see if the sequence is here. And it should be, so we can see the job ID sequence here, okay? Like most editors, if you right click, hit create sequence, allows you to create one. Whoops, that didn't do what I wanted. But sometimes you can do right click and script. I can do a create script there. Let's try doing this again. Right click and create script. And this should script out something I just created, okay? Discard, don't save. So this was generated from the code we had before. I just cleaned it up and did a begin end statement. That's all I did. Let's load the database. Okay, again, this is a toy database. I'd be doing ETL, but this is a good thing to talk about what's different, okay? Because there's some things that are different, okay? First and foremost, guess what? When we insert stuff, okay, when we write code, we have to do something because we don't know what language it's written in, right? And this $sign something $sign is just a big marker. It says, hey, between this marker and all the way down to this marker, the language is PostgreSQL. So use that interpreter to actually parse it and run it, okay? I haven't tried mixed languages. That should be interesting, but I have enough with the first one, my SQL language, so I'm not going to try it. But yeah, you could do Python or whatever. So raise notice basically says, hey, guess what? I'm starting the insert. delete, we're clearing some data. And then we're going to do a bunch of inserts, right? Nothing to write home up here. It's true false values. I did zeros and ones as text. Let me see if I can find something that was a little more interesting. So we can see it also does Unicode if we wanted to. That's another thing. By default, it automatically supports Unicode, which is kind of cool. Here's another thing that you might want to catch. When you go ahead and you actually work with binary, it's not X0 in the binary, it's actually a string /X. That tells it's a hex string, okay? It's really a binary array. What else did I say? Oh, yes, doing money. Microsoft might $sign to $20. Guess what? A money data type is quote, and then 20.00, your decimals quote, okay? So that's another change. So going through here, these are all different code blocks, and I can just run them all at once and they'll suddenly work. Getting to the last one that was really important that you have to catch. A lot of times when you work with different languages, they have different ways they respect dates, right? And the problem is when you dump from SQL Server, our dates are month, day, year, right? Well, that's not the format, that's the default format. So we need to use the convert to timestamp to actually get the format done. So this, even though this is only SQL statements and probably only good for a toy database or reference, it's a good exercise to go through because it tells you, hey, guess what? I have to worry about dates. I need to worry about hex. Oh, Unicode is already supported. You know, data that's in a money type is going to be an issue, right? It's going to run this, and guess what? It ran already. It's pretty quick, right? Perform it. And now we can just go over and say, hey, I want to look at maybe the sales. So script, I want to do a select script. It's going to create a new script, new window, just to select all the fields from here and run it. And we have data. Awesome. So we have data in there. So we talked about modernizing code. Why don't we only got a few more slides? I'm just guessing, trying to plan out the total time of this. Why don't we go on to other slides about what I had to do? So don't save, get rid of this one. I think it was a number 5. So we're going to bring up the query too. Number 5 is going to apply referential integrity. So primary and foreign keys. Okay, so I'm going to run this, and this is the same stuff I had before. No change before, except for maybe public to DBO. Next thing is we want to apply check constraints, is things within certain values, right? We can't have more than, it has to be less than 250 for the job level. This was something I had to make changes to. In SQL Server, there's a like command. So I can say zip like a pattern, right? There's something called reg expression like, so you're gonna have to change that. Also, we can start combining things. Like for instance, I'm doing a set notation, pub ID in the set, or pub ID like a regical expression, okay? So nothing to really write home about, but that's the changes I did for check constraints. They work. Now let's bring up the last thing. We'll walk through it. This is the hottest part. This is the code. And the code will take you the most time. I had a project, it took me 3 or 4 weeks to first understand the code because it was buggy, and then actually to get it performed, okay? So basically drop view of exists, that's fine, and then create a view. So that's gonna work, and we can test it. So I'm gonna run the view, run this. Now it said, okay, it's there. I put this, we have the same comments as regular SQL. We can run this and we can see that it brought some data back. Okay, that's nothing to write home about, it's just a simple view. Let's do something a little more complicated. In the original pubs, there's a function called by royalty. Okay, this is the royalty, and say, hey, give me all the one that has a percentage of 10. We can see the syntax is different here. I used var underscore as the name of the variables coming in versus, hey, it's returning the table. So when we actually return, say from SQL, we can do select star from table. We don't have to tell what function is. In here, though, we have to do it, right? So we're going to run this one. I'm going to drop it and recreate it. And see, I'm using different function names because you can't have the same block called multiple times. And now I can say, give me all the ones that are 30. Okay, come on, it works. How about this one? I'm going to run all the rest and we'll talk about them. So I ran everything, hopefully, maybe run everything. There we go. So everything's been deployed, and let's go because we only got a few more minutes. I want to make sure I get it all in. This one's a little more complicated. Now we're going to call it, going to return the table, But no, what we're doing is we're grouping by a roll-up. And when grouping level is 1, then we do all, otherwise we do pub ID. So this is just going to return some results, not doing any select, so it's not that complicated. And we can see here's the publishers. We got 4 publishers. And there's the average price for selling those books, okay? That's pretty interesting. Let's do another grouping. This time we're going to do grouping, and we're going to do average year to date sales, but we're going to group by not only the publisher ID, but the type of book, right? We want to know. And so if we run this one, okay, wow, we got a lot more, right? We got all, we got psychology, the publisher's ID is this, average year to date. Well, didn't sell too many books on psychology, right? Business, we got a lot of books. Okay, this one actually does some filtering, says, hey, give me the price between these 2 values, and we're going to group by these 2 and get me a count of books sold. So now I can say, hey, guess what? How many psychology books were sold that have a price between $10 and $19? And we can get the listing. How many business books were sold between $2 and 25 cents? And that's when I started reading books when I was a kid. They don't cost $2.25 anymore, and $10, right? And we can see these numbers. Last but not least, let's talk about triggers and stored code, okay? So triggers a little different. We basically define a trigger. We define a function to do the trigger, okay? So in here, we're going to say, hey, guess what? We're going to define this insert update trigger, returns a trigger as, and again, we have to do a code block. Now, there's something different. When we return stuff, we use the into, but there's a record type. So I'm going to say select the min value and the max value and the job from employee. So I'm going to join employee and job together into the record, okay? Going to join these 2. So now I have some data. But the interesting thing is that we're going to call this for each record. And when we call this for each record, we have something called new. And new is a single record, not like in SQL Server in which you get an insert table that has multiple records, or you have a delete that has multiple records, has a single record. So we're matching it up and we're trying 2 test cases. If you get job 1 and then the level's not 10, it's going to error out. If your job is not less than the min and max levels of it, it's going to error out. So I just put in 2 test cases. This is my sister, God rest her soul, thing, gave her level 9, so it's going to error out. And guess what? It falls right there. It says, hey, you failed. And then the last one, we can put myself in. I'm number 2, but 9 is less than the baseline level. And guess what? Now it says it had to be between 200 and 250. So again, this is going to be the hardest part, is to translate the code. I gave you some really good examples of functions. Store procedures only do things. They don't return values. So you can make them return values, not that elegant, so use functions. Store procedures to do actions and triggers to prevent actions, okay? Going back to the slide deck and trying to wrap up, got a few minutes and some really important topics to talk about. No more demos. So system access, okay? There's no such thing as a user. Everything's a role. So what is a user? It's a role that has one person associated with it, which has logon permissions, okay? You can do grant, alter, and revoke. And guess what? The database supports both server and predefined database roles. This concept is the Achilles heel of Postgres, and I want to talk about it. Other databases do a little more elegantly. It may cause some performance problems, and if you know why it's there, then you can play it accordingly, okay? We always worry about a session, how one session writes while another session has ACID properties. In Postgres, it uses something called multiple version concurrency control. And what's doing in this example is we're taking from the movies table, Shaoling and Wei Tang, and we're changing the data of the movie, right? So we have the first page in the table. We make a change. Guess what? It's not actually deleting it and putting a new record in. It's only a pen-only database, okay, or a storage. So it's going to make a copy of it. And not only that, it doesn't copy just the pointer to the row in the column that was changed. It copies the whole tuple. And also this impacts the index, okay? And what does it cause? Well, this was designed, okay, Postgres back in the 80s, and that's before log, okay, and right ahead logging came about. The issues: creates a full copy of the tuple, creates table bloat, creates index bloat. interesting thing is, guess what? There's an auto vacuum process, okay? There was an undertaking with the Postgres project, because it's open source, to try to fix this. They started it and they never finished it. How does Oracle and MySQL fix this? And what they do is they use tuple deltas, meaning that, the pointer and what really changed in the column uses less space, less bloat, vacuum eventually catches up. System monitoring. How am I going to monitor this? Like, before we had Query Star, we always had problems, right? Guess what? There's two things. There's something called PG stats, okay? For if you're doing IS, which is you installing it, rolling it yourself, there's a module out there, check it out. Also, there's Query Stool. If you're like me, old school, guess what? Create a log table. You got a huge store procedure. It's doing 10 different things. Guess what? Break into chunks that are restartable. Use temp tables, right? Log before and after. Now you know the timings, right? Regardless of the technique, collecting statistics and finding the rogue query is part of your DBA job. Other topics, okay? Guess what? Read the user manual here. If you really trust ChatGPT, ask it a question. Maybe it'll give you an answer. And I got this, because sometimes it gives you a wrong answer. What does it support? We can do replication with PubSub. We can do full text indexing. It creates vectors, supports vectors. And it's really cool because in SQL Server, when you do full text indexing, you don't see how it parses up the terms and gives it values. And here you do, and you get to pick, hey, do I want to use inverted index or do I want to use a regular index, a btrieve? High availability. Uses synchronous replication and standby service. Learn all about it. GIS we talked about for spatial data. How do we deploy it? Okay. SQL Server gives you this great thing called SQL Packager. Looks at the target, has a source schema, says, hey, what's different, makes a change. How can we do that? Look at Liquid Base. Liquid Base says, hey, I got those 7 scripts. I'm going to create a table out there, and Flyway does something similar. It's from Redgate. You might see recently Grant and Steve Jones talking about Flyway. They had a great play, and I commented on it. But anyways, both of them do the same thing. They put out a table. They look at your code. Hey, I want to run version 1. Get it to work in independent files that run correctly. Once you get that done, it hashes it, puts it in the table, and applies it. Second time you run the deployment, it says, hey, guess what? I've already created a database. I don't need to run it again. So those are 2 tools you can do. Remember, if you're doing a service, you don't have to worry about anything. Backups are all done. When you're doing a virtual machine, you have to do. Also, vacuum service handles fragmentation, but guess what? If you're having fragmentation because you're doing a lot of updates, maybe you have to run a job in the day to fix it, okay? High availability. This is the best thing about it. I already talked about it. Guess what? We got Linux box here and runs really quick. We got our data right ahead logging, zone redundant, and guess what? We got a standby server that's really hot and ready to go. Guess what? You can fail over to it. And it's using clusters, AKS, right? So we're doing containers, which is kind of cool. Summary. So Postgres database is great, right? It's open source. It's the only one that's left out there. I mean, MySQL used to be open source. Oracle bought it. It might be still considered open source, but I really don't. I think Postgres is the only one that's out there. We talked about what is the method to migrate from one database to another, right? We need to do an inventory, figure out dependencies, first migrate the tables that are empty, load the data, load all your constraints, and then redeploy your performant written code, right? Because it has to be in GSQL now, okay? Regardless if you buy a tool, they don't all work 100% of the time, so having a understanding of the language is must. Just be cognizant of multi-version currency control. If you need something that is really high performant on updates, then test it before you go to PostgreSQL. I don't know it'll be performant enough for your use case. If it is, then it's perfect. Basically, just adding PostgreSQL to your skill set is another way to make you marketable. And so, yeah, this is my journey this year. I will be writing and learning about Postgres. Ton of links: history of Postgres, DevTools, Perl conversion strip I showed you, Strawberry Perl, the client tools downdrive, of course, drivers, ODBC, JDBC, talk about indexing, the language, MVC. Second page, we talked about how to collect statistics. So you got this extension, you got the query store that's only built for Azure, right? And again, I'll go back to this example. If we look, it's already there. See Azure Maintenance and Azure Sys. This is your query store. It's already sitting there. We talked about replication, full text, high availability, the geospatial, and how to deploy. So I am a few minutes over. I apologize, but any questions at this time?
I was just, it's me, Jeremy. I was just looking at some of the pricing and just like doing a simple calculator in Azure, it almost looks like it's a third of the cost of Microsoft's SQL offerings. So that looks kind of good in the long run.
It's very attractive. The cool thing about it is I really love the extensions you can do in it. So you can go really wild and look at vectors and like creating hierarchies and inheritance on data types. But if you stay vanilla, you can still solve a lot of problems with the core data types and constructs.
Cool.
Any
Thanks.
other questions? Thank you,
Hey,
Jeremy,
John,
for the feedback.
Just
Go ahead.
Can you hear me, John?
Yep, can hear you.
Just real quick. You did a sample in your presentation of a function and you used the PGSQL language,
Yes.
right? So the other options were Perl. Can you use Perl or Python in that context?
There is multi-language support, which kind of makes it crazy, and that's why we have to do the code block begin
Yeah.
and end. So if you're
Yeah,
not
yeah.
used to all the languages, then yeah, you'll be like, oh wow, which language? But use SQL, I like it. Right here. Where is it? Here it is. Okay, so it supports PGSQL, which is just basically ANSI SQL. I've never
Yeah.
done TCL. Perl, I've done, and I've done Python.
Right. Okay. So I guess my question is, in the DDL for the function, you would
Yep.
specify the language Python and then invoke Python syntax for the rest of the coding.
Yeah.
assuming.
So for instance, let's take and again, a little segue because we got time. Let's go look at Postgres SQL Python function. So let's take a look at a Python function. So yeah, see, let's use the Python function. So you're just see right here, it's basically you have to have it tabbed in correctly. It has a colon on the if instead of a then, right? It returns an A and a return B. Again, your syntax is just gonna now you can use strip. So if you're passing in the text, right, you can use the strip function, and so now you suddenly get all that Python stuff that you didn't have there before.
Yeah.
It's a little sparse here. I would do one things I did find about Postgres here, the actual community page was sparse on documentation. This one was pretty good. PostgreSQL has some really good examples, so I suggest you take a look at it. But yeah, you could call a procedure and do curses and all that fun stuff. And again, why do it when I'm a DBA? I want to stay more with the T-SQL concepts, but you can do tries,
No.
except.
Understood. Just I never seen that like in all the like you don't have that option in Oracle, I believe, and as well as SQL Server. At least I don't.
But you do have it in MySQL, which is one of the things in
Right.
MySQL you have to
Yeah.
kind of do the brackets, and so those are both all open source, so definitely.
Correct. Okay, thanks.
Oh, did I not share the screen? I apologize. I
It's
thought I
okay.
was sharing. Let me go.
I was visualizing it.
I'll visualize it more. So this is the one right here, which you can go take a look at it. This one has better examples, so you can show you, hey, there's a connect string and so on. But if we go to the original manual here, the manuals are very sparse. That's the only thing I have to say about Postgres I don't like. But again, you can pick up a book or you can just, Google out there. This one, you can see it's doing a strip. So that's a function there. You can define global variables and so on. But see, this is all they have here. And then I guess you can go next, but see, it goes right in the data values. It doesn't go into their Python. But there's some cool things here like byte A and byte B and so on, or byte S, which is like strings and so on. So yeah, it's just crazy. You can go to town, man. Learn a new language and a database.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it obviously it integrates as a data source in ADF.
I haven't played around with ADF in this yet, so I assume that. Good question. Yes, a lot of good questions today. ADF, copy, Postgres. I bet you there is a driver out there, or if not, you could do it. Copy and transfer data Azure database for. There you go. The copy activity supports it, and you'd want to do this flexible server. And so you can read all about it. I'll put that in the window.
There is a request. John, there is a request for the presentation. So if you can send it to Jen or to me, we will upload it together with the recording of the session.
Yep, I will give it to you right in a minute. So if we go down to here and find the word.
Oh, if you have it on GitHub, just share the link.
Yep, that's what I'm going to do again. I already did this, but I will there you go. That includes all the code in the presentation.
Thanks, John.
You're welcome, man. Thank you. Cool. Well, I'm going to go one more round and then I'm going to call it. Any other questions? I tried to stick close to an hour. I know we always run a few minutes over.
No,
Lot to present.
It's a user group. It's not a conference, so the time is a bit flexible.
Yeah, I try to stay on punch because I know that other people have other stuff to do, like during lunch and so on. So, hey, awesome. Thank you for everyone for attending. I hope you learned something useful today, and definitely check out Postgres. Grant is checking it out too. Redgate's doing a lot of work in that area, and have a great day.
Thanks a lot. Good day, everyone, and join us next week. Bye-bye, John. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks, John.
You're welcome.